Welcome. This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. You know, the whole reason we exist is to try and help rekindle the American spirit. Part of that's helping you regain your sense of agency, especially in a world of doomers where we have all these people telling us about all the terrible things. But when it comes to our kids, we actually do oftentimes have to be more concerned. And we have certainly gotten our share of people who have called in or who have written in that are concerned about their kids being recruited into oftentimes extremist organizations. So we brought back Dr. Emily Bashah. We're going to talk about kids today. We're going to talk about how it is that you can keep your kids from being recruited into organizations that are more extremist. Now, this work that we do, both Emily and I, Dr. Bashah and I, volunteer all of our time. We highly recommend that if you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button. It'll cost you nothing. Or if you don't like all the commercials that come with it, go to www.optamerican.com/premium. And there you can actually become one of our premium members. But we even appreciate your comments. Comments can be anything from questions, telling us what it was that you liked, and we get people who tell us what they don't like. Actually, we read all three because we want to try to improve and to get better. And so your comments really do matter to us, and we appreciate them when you leave them. But again, this show, we're going to focus on not just the whole idea of optimism, but what it is that we can do to make certain that our kids are safe and that they're not recruited into these types of organizations. Dr. Bashah, welcome back to the Optimistic American as one of our co-hosts.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, so the first question that I want to do is, before we get directly to talking about how do we keep our kids from being recruited into extremist organizations and the dangers of that and whether or not there's any real possibility that that can happen, let's kind of recoup. You and I wrote a book that was called Addictive Ideologies. In that book, we talked about how people in general are recruited into organizations. And we also talked about when it was a problem. We've both looked at, we just came back from Bosnia. We've looked at genocides all over the world. We've seen extremist movements that have happened not only here, but in other places in Western democracy. You spent an awful lot of time on working with extremists and terrorists who are going to spend the rest of their life in prison, doing evaluations on them and trying to gain a better understanding of who they are. Let's just start with the premise of when is it a problem?
Yeah, and also to highlight your work and contribution in the book as a political expert and also investing a lot of your time trying to reduce and eradicate extremism in the political sphere nationally and also globally. That's been a major contribution to our work, and I think a really powerful complement to the forensic and social psychological work that we've done to really try and deconstruct what is going on psychologically at an individual level, at a societal level, community level, and then even greater at a political level. So in our work, we've looked at genocides, acts of terrorism, and various forms of extremism to see what are some of the commonalities and common factors. And we find ideology is oftentimes the leading factor in growing extremism. And so it could leave people vulnerable to being recruited or radicalized into different extreme groups. Now, breaking that down even further, these ideologies tend to be driven by kind of a groupthink mentality, meaning that people learn to see themselves as victims and being really held to that victim mindset and seeing others as outsiders who are oppressing them. And so this often fuels the legitimacy to hate them and to see them as...
To objectify them.
To objectify them, to hate them, to dehumanize them. And that often lets people then ostracize them and commit violence, extreme forms of violence, because they don't see them as equals. And then there's this addictive component where people become quite obsessive. They tend to separate themselves. There are these push and pull factors. So they separate themselves from people who think differently or their family members who love them and are concerned about them, and really pull towards people who think more in those extreme polarized forms. And then that can also help to like perpetuate and push them more towards violent ends. So, during all of those forms, and I think we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about not just the risk factors, but where can we, as parents, as family members, as community members, where can we intervene to prevent someone from going to that polarized extreme end?
All right. And if you would, just talk a little bit about this whole psychological need to be right and how it is that ideologies help feed that.
Yeah, there's interesting research that is coming out looking at neurological and neurochemical mechanisms that are connected to being right or the perception of winning an argument. We get this rush of dopamine and adrenaline, and we want that back. It helps us to feel morally superior to another person, and then we become addicted to it. We want that feeling back. And it's hard to really think rationally, to act kindly, to want to consider the other person and their feelings. We're just derailing all of those things because really we just want to win this argument, perpetuate this moral superiority, and dominate them.
Yeah, I find one of the fascinating pieces of work that you've done is on Incel, the involuntarily celibate group, kind of a lovely organization of young men who think that somehow or another that they've been denied sex and that women have reversed raped them. So it's okay for them to rape and kill women. And you would think that it's like has to be de minimis in terms of its numbers, but it's actually been put on the Justice Department list of a group that they're now keeping their eye on because of the growing numbers that are happening there. What's interesting about that group is they put out this dictionary with hundreds of different words. And when you think about the value of those words without going through all of them, it serves two purposes. One, it kind of cloaks who they are. You would hear these words and you wouldn't know what most of them meant. But it also gives them a special power in a debate. When they begin to debate and to argue and they use these set of words, which might be like Chad, which represents the guy who is the most aggressive and best looking and always gets the most women. And then they have two different names for the different women. And they have this whole dictionary of them. But it gives them this sense of power because the other person who might be listening to them or trying to disagree with them, they really don't even understand what they're talking about. And that gives the person in the ideology the sense that they won, that they actually came out on top. And for people who aren't used to winning, that in itself can be a powerful sensation. More importantly, that dopamine that you talked about a moment ago, when it's released, it acts like a drug. It gives you a sense of being high. Now, I found it interesting in one of our past discussions, you spoke about oxytocin, that comes from a different source. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, oxytocin comes from love. It comes from feeling valued, feeling heard, being accepted and validated. It's a nurturing neurochemical that's released in.
And I find what's interesting about that is you can find the same sense of high from finding a connection to other people. Now, maybe they're finding both. Maybe they're getting dopamine from feeling right about their argument with outsiders and oxytocin from feeling like they're a part of a brotherhood. But
right.
as we get to thinking about what are we going to do to help our children who might be confronting these types of issues, I think both of those ought to be at the top of our mind. So if you would, why don't you start by telling me, when are our kids the most at risk for being recruited into some type of extreme organization?
Yeah, I think especially looking at youth and adolescents, one of the common features of that developmental period is feeling out of sorts with oneself. Hormones are, still, their bodies are still developing. They're feeling a sense of awkwardness, feeling very insecure. Identity formation is often at play. And they're just trying to find a place to fit in, yet at the same time not really having this sense of fitting in anywhere. And so recruiters can prey on this natural awkwardness and insecurity of adolescents. They'll often find them through different online chat rooms or social media or online gaming, where they can conceal their true identities, appear like they're their peers, offer them a sense of validation, or make it seem like they really get what they're feeling, or their failures or inadequacies or insecurities in their life. And once they have that link and connection, can then start to undermine them and manipulate them, and they could be charismatic and charming. So oftentimes with the forensic evaluations that I do, even with online predators, I'll ask them, where do they go to find victims? And so they'll often mention online chat rooms.
By the way, these are evals that you're doing at people that oftentimes are in jail that are actually the predators.
Correct. Yeah. And so I'm there to do a psychological evaluation. So, those are the primary platforms. So I know there's a lot of groups out there encouraging parents, if you're going to give a child a smartphone, like really monitoring and having a lot of the safeguards on there, but more importantly, knowing your child, being invested in what they're doing, what their fears are, what their concerns are, what they're scared about, what they're stressed about. So that's going to be the biggest protective factor, is knowing.
All right. So knowing is certainly important. I think it's also important that we talk about, just for a moment, at some point things get away from us. I've already raised 2 adult children, but we now have a 2-year-old child, and going all the way back through that, which has been a lot of fun, but it's also a learning experience in its own. Understanding that development cycle becomes important. Understanding when it is that your children actually learn to connect with other people, and more importantly, when it is that they begin to gain those feelings that maybe they don't connect, that they're not connected. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's lots of different developmental periods that occur that, brains are still developing. We know from neurological studies, more recently, research is saying the frontal lobe is developing up until the late 20s. And so that's a place of executive functioning, to make logical, rational decisions. Planning, judgment, decision-making, all of those things become really critical and important. Social emotional intelligence is also a big part of cognitive development. And so learning and imitating through modeling, connecting to other children, all of that helps develop moral reasoning, which is also incredibly important for development. And so while parents, like helicopter parents, or wanting to shield or shelter their child, think that they're really helping them, it actually could harm them long term, because it's really preventing them from failing, and rather than getting extremely hurt, later on, because they just were very naive and ignorant and didn't have that sense of self-confidence or building blocks that are built into them to prevent that. It's actually hurting them. So
it was surprising to me to learn from you that really the most aggressive period in a human being's life is about the age of 2 to 4 years old. And that's the period of time when they actually start to learn to relate to other people. And if they don't learn to relate to other people, that small percentage that don't, those are the ones that become the most at risk to becoming aggressive to the point of being a problem afterwards. Talk about that a little, if you would.
Yeah, and I often see this trend in the evaluations that I do, is that these people who they really had no group that they felt like they belonged to. So it could be through no fault of their own. Maybe their families were frequently moving, so they never really had a sense of building those connections. And then they always felt somewhat like so different and so much of an outsider. and always quite isolated and rejected and alienated. And it could even start from their own home environment. So oftentimes we're seeing things like blended families. And so it could be step families that are then rejecting or alienating other family members or children who are being brought in and blended into a family. So it just adds that more complexity. And when I'm seeing that, especially where there is no place that there is for this child to feel like they belong, and that is a group or a person or a circle that they feel that they can go to and feel safe and comfortable in. That's a huge risk factor for them developmentally, and especially if it perpetuates into school and academia and other things in their future. There's always this lack of connection and this separation, and they don't necessarily have this empathic connection with others.
When does that form?
So it starts from age 2 to 4. You know, you see with even play and development, but if it perpetuates, that's when I really start to see that the risk factors continue psychologically.
So it's difficult for a parent to try to figure out, like, when do I intervene and when do I not intervene? Like, is my child being bullied, or are they bullying other children? And at the same time, knowing that you have to kind of let them learn to deal with those relationships on their own, because that's the period that they learn. How do you draw that line?
Yeah, this is a hard line, right? And it's hard to know, when do I intervene? When do I give my child the skills to learn to defend themselves, or appreciate the mindset of another person? I mean, that is what separates us and makes us uniquely human, is this theory of mind, appreciating that this other person has different feelings and thoughts and beliefs.
Don't gloss over that theory of mind. Talk about what that is for a moment.
Yeah, it is very uniquely human, and it is something that occurs developmentally, and we see with people with developmental disorders may have fundamental challenges to developing this, and we see that with autism spectrum disorders, that there's this deficit in being able to connect and relate and appreciate that other people think or behave or have histories and experiences that are different than our own, that inform what they do, how they see the world, how they relate to us.
I find it interesting. Even the term of bullying is being redefined. You know, I saw a sign up in our little girl's school that talked about what bullying was. And it actually picked up the new definition that we've been reading from a lot of social scientists, and that bullying isn't any act of aggression that takes place. Bullying is first where one child completely overpowers the other, either because there are 3 of them versus 1, or because one's a 5th grader and one's a 1st grader. Right, that's the first portion of it. The second one is that it becomes chronic, meaning that it happens today and tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. And so that it continues on with the child who is on the losing side of it, having no sense of ever being able to win. The reason that definition seems to be changing is because we're recognizing that there's actually a value to letting kids work out most of this stuff on their own, not swooping in, not saving them, even if they're not doing well. Sometimes, you know, if your child decides that they're going to be selfish and not share their toys, they may find that the other kids don't want to play with them. And when they find that the other kids don't want to play with them, then they have to figure out, well, do they want to make that compromise so that other kids will play with them, as opposed to getting in trouble for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And how you parent matters. So if you're punishing your child or have a more like punitive form of authority over them, then the child is really learning, well, I should only do this because I want to avoid punishment, without really appreciating the reasoning or rationale behind it. So they miss those other pieces. And on top of that, if you're shaming your child because of certain behaviors, the risk is that they start internalizing that shame and see themselves as a bad person, rather than really appreciating, well, it's not me that's bad, it's the behavior that's bad, but now I need to really understand why.
All right. So as a parent, we're going to talk a little bit about the acronym that we came up with in a moment. But I really want to focus for a second just on this idea of modeling. The idea that oftentimes in our conversations that we have with our friends or our spouse or other people as the adult figure, we can be polarizing. And so that we can begin to create an environment of polarization.
Yeah, I think it's important to show how do you communicate? How do you assert your opinion while still respecting somebody who thinks differently than you? How do you model anti-fragility? I think that's an important component. How do you model confidence and courage and bravery and doing things, despite disagreements with another side, and opposition from another side? And if you're at home and you're maybe watching the news or watching TV or having a conversation with your spouse or complaining about a boss or a coworker, the child also hears all of that. And so if you're also blaming a common enemy or opposing this out group, like we were talking about earlier, dehumanizing another group because they think differently than you, your child is going to be picking up on that. So all of those things become really important. If you're wanting your child to develop ego strength, this is another thing that I oftentimes see in the evaluations that I do, is that people learn all these kinds of defense mechanisms to cover up their insecurities and inadequacies and failures because they just don't have that ego strength. It's never been built up for them to confront the truth. And so much of that is learned through modeling.
All right, so you've created a wonderful worksheet for parents.
We have.
Oh, we have, but you did most of the work. Well, let's put it this way: the work that has scientific data behind it, as opposed to somebody just saying, "Well, here's my opinion. I'm good at my opinion."
Well,
but
no, you're a political social scientist in your own right.
Okay,
you've earned it.
But let's just say that this paper has a doctorate behind it. If you go to our website, you'll find that there's a worksheet on kids. You've created many worksheets to deal with this whole concept, but there's one with kids and the concern about being recruited. It's a very, very good paper. But we created an acronym, T.R.I.P.L.E.D, to try and help parents think about what are the actual most important points. So if we can, why don't you walk us through that?
Okay, well, first let's just say what T.R.I.P.L.E.D stands for. So it's an acronym. Since, Paul, you're an entrepreneur, I love that you created this term because it's the concept of tripling your investments as a parent into parenting. And oftentimes we don't know if we're successful at what we're doing until 25 years later.
Oh, yeah, 25-year experiment.
It's a 25-year experiment.
And I've seen those go wrong. Where you had idea A and outcome B happened.
Thank God your daughter is your third child.
But both of my boys are good boys. But I went through a period of times, just as my father went through some with me. But I do believe that. I say, look, I look for in my company is a 10x return. I want a 10x return on the investment that I'm going to put in. And that doesn't just mean the investment of money. That means the investment of my time and what it is that we're doing. And by constantly striving to find a 10x return, maybe you only get to a 5x return or a 6x return, but you're going to do a lot better than if you're saying, well, I just want a 20% return on my money, which isn't 1/10, that's literally 1/100th of a return. Well, in parenting, gosh, parents are busy. They have a lot going on. And so thinking about what are the traits that I can exemplify that will give me the highest potential return with my children, that have the highest odds of being successful, they matter. And to me, that usually comes down to some type of formula, right? All companies are a matter of who are your people, what are your processes?
Yeah.
Those are the two factors that matter in your systems, right? Well, this is a system, and it's a process to try and help follow. And it's one that it's not perfect, but it really gives you a good idea on how to substantially improve the investment of time that you're putting into your children.
Yeah, and I think as parents, oftentimes pausing and reflecting is one of the biggest things that you can do as a parent rather than just being reactive. So let's deep dive into it. So T.R.I.P.L.E.D, T stands for truth. So that's trust and truth that are interconnected. R is for...
Let's break these down just for a moment. I think truth is important because it is really important that your children tell the truth. Part of that's going to be, do you tell the truth, right? But part of that's also going to be, this is a guarantee. If your children are terrified of you, if they know I'm going to get beat or this is going to be a severe punishment, the first thing they learn to do is lie. Now, you may hate lying, but believe me, if your punishments are over the top, it's going to teach them to. And what over the top means for a 4-year-old is dramatically different than what it means for a 40-year-old. It won't seem as severe to you as it will to them. In fact, one of the things that I read a great book on was underachievers. And I'm not going to go through the whole book, but one of the things that I liked about the book is it said, hey, underachievers oftentimes come from a feeling of insecurity inside a household. And the point that they made is that literally you have to say 10 good things to a child to make up for the insecurity that you create by saying one negative thing. So if you say, if you want to be a part of this household, you'll take the garbage out. That may seem insignificant to you. But what if they actually take that literally?
I'm not as significant.
I'm not secure here.
Yeah, or I don't have value unless I do something.
Right. And again, that I'm not trying to tell people you shouldn't punish your children. I'm just saying that it's real easy as a parent with all the stresses that we have to be negative a lot and to let that become overpowering. It's important that you focus on joy, that you focus on enjoyment, enjoying them and letting them enjoy you. And again, making certain that the punishments aren't so harsh that at the end you lose truth.
Yeah, and trusting them to do hard things is a huge component of that. Emily Wojcicki, I have a hard time saying her last name. She wrote a great book on that and also has her own acronyms for parenting. But yeah, the biggest thing that she was pushing forward on was really saying, like, trust your children to do more than you think that they're capable of. And
as I recall, she raised 3 or 4 highly successful daughters in life. One was at the executive level of Google. Okay, R.
So respect the rights of every individual, including your children. So it connects to truth in that way that you have to show, again, that you're not overpowering them, but allowing them to really explore. In our worksheet, we do talk about scaffolding, and I think that this is an important part that's interconnected to this teachings for parent. And it's a model for me that I'm using with our daughter. And the idea of scaffolding is every child has a developmental stage. And you see this as parents, like, they just went through a growth spurt and now they're doing so many more new things cognitively, physically, emotionally. And you always want to accept where they are and yet always demand more. And so knowing where their limits are and pushing them beyond those limits. So knowing that they're not fully going to excel or exceed what you're expecting of them is important, rather than just giving them less and helping them just to achieve within that smaller range. And that's an important part of encouraging them to self-explore, but they're also learning to build that strength and courage and resilience within themselves.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. If your children go out for accelerated classes, and then they come back with a C, and then you're highly disappointed with them, what'd they learn? Don't take the accelerated classes.
Yeah, take the easy classes
take the
and
easy
get
classes,
A's.
right? That's what you've taught
challenged.
them, right? So you have to be careful with that. The second thing that I see in being important in that is that the idea of respecting individuals, there are 2 places that's important. Here's the first one. All of us get upset with groups. We watch the news. I don't care which one you watch, Fox News, CNN, you pick. There's the other outlier group, the group that you think isn't doing the right thing. And if you can watch Fox News, I can tell you which group you think that is. And if you watch CNN, I can tell you which group you think that is, right? Point is this. If you begin to objectify them, your child learns to objectify people. Right? Sometimes giving respect to people that you disagree and showing them that you can do that, that's a trait that you're modeling for your child so that they can see, hey, even though we may disagree with people, we can find a way to listen to them. And for your child, one of the most important things they can learn in their life is to work with a whole group of different people. The more types of people they can work with, it is a guarantee, the higher the level of success that they will have and happiness that they will have. And then there's the other part of respect, respecting them. I see parents do this all the time, and people sometimes that I'm very close to. They have an idea of what they want their child to achieve, and it kind of is because what the child does reflects on them. It reflects on their life and whether or not they're a success and whether or not they're smart and whether or not they're going to be able to do the great things because their child did a great thing. Man, you're setting up an expectation for a child that's going to be very, very difficult. Helping them learn to enjoy what they enjoy, letting them learn to fail and succeed and to be able to know that they can be okay with both, that's going to partly come from respecting them for being them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's connected to the next one, which is the I for independence. I also included individuation and autonomy as part of this that helps to promote that ego strength that we were talking about before. And the way that I practice this with our daughter is really to give her choices. And it could be something that you see as minimal as a parent, but I think, offering one of 2 or 3 choices, whether it's foods that they eat or what they want to play with or when they want to go have a bath or read a story. I was just dropping off my daughter at preschool the other day, and I asked her, do you want mommy to walk you to the class, or do you want me to drop you off at the front of the class so the assistant can walk you in? And she chose to be dropped off at the front so the assistant can walk her in because she's seeing that's what all the other children are doing. I was so proud of her for making that choice, and she made it for herself, and I supported it. So
Do you want the red dress or the blue dress?
Yeah. It could be simple choices that you don't even think of as a parent. But again,
I loved my dad. His choices were usually, do you want to eat your mashed potatoes or wear them on top of your head? That's the type of choice that we're talking about.
No, that was a different time and a different parenting.
Believe me, it was a different time. And again, I love him. He was one of my idols. But I think I wore the mashed potatoes on top of my head once or twice. All right.
That's experimenting.
All right. So P.
P is for purpose. So, as we talk about in our book, a big part of developing agency is having a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's key to living a valuable life rather than trying to pursue happiness as being your end goal and end result.
Right. And I really would stress this. I find way too many people say, well, I'm not happy. First, I don't mean, I guess this is a bad reflection of me. I don't even know what that word means, right? It's so difficult to guess. There are periods in your life where maybe your parents pass away or something bad happens in your relationship. It's really hard to be happy. It almost doesn't matter what you've done, right? It's hard to be happy in those moments. And then sometimes happiness is like, man, it'll come and it's there for like 5 or 10 minutes and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And then it goes back to being normal again. It's go back to being normal. But purpose is something that can serve you for your lifetime. Your sense of purpose, I think it's important when you think about your children to recognize it really only comes from 4 things. It comes from who or what you love. All right. Now that's hard for children because, you learn as a parent unconditional love. You learn, I'm going to love you. It almost doesn't matter how you mess up. But that's really not how kids love. That's something that is acquired over time. They can learn to love things. They can say, gosh, I really, I love going swimming. All right. They can learn to love that. The second thing that you get purpose from is what you create. Right? And you can create companies, you can create things in your work, you can create music, you can create art. There's all types of things that you can create. The third area is service, serving other people. And, that, again, it takes time to understand the value of that, but it is an incredible sense of purpose. But the last one is struggle. when we go through struggles, we either learn lessons. Well, we're going to learn a lesson no matter what, but we can either learn to help that in our growth, or we can learn to allow that to defeat us. It's all a question of what you choose. But understanding that the meaning of purpose, and I love Viktor Frankl's meaning of life. It's one of my favorites. But the point is, understanding that plays a role in your child's development.
Yeah, wonderful. And so the next one is love, L for love. So that's treating yourself and others with love, kindness, dignity, and I think that's important. We talked about before that releases oxytocin. It helps us to feel connected to others. It shapes and informs our identity. It is interconnected to meaning and purpose.
Okay,
the next one is engagement. So that's really where you're participating, collaborating, engaging with others, that you're doing something greater for a greater purpose and sharing in something that is bigger than yourself. And so participating and engaging in that is an important part of contributing. Mm-hmm. And then the next one
is... that also includes engaging with them. You engaging with them. It includes you engaging with them and them engaging with others. Mm-hmm. Being a part of something bigger. And we all are.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is connected to resilience. Mm-hmm. And the next one is deliver. Don't just say what you're going to do, actually do more than what you say, mm-hmm. so that you prove to others that you're reliable, you're dependable, that you're accountable for yourself. And that's a big part of building agency.
Yeah, and I would say on delivered, there are two parts of that are important. The first one is modeling. You model that for your child, but just as important is teaching them to deliver. Right, that they have results that they have to deliver as well. If they have to clean up their room, or if they have to, if they've got to do their homework at night, or there are things that they have to do that you have to expect that they will learn to deliver. Now, again, I'd be careful about over punishing on them, but you want to make certain that your child learns, hey, I have things that I have to deliver. There are things that are part of my life where delivery is important as well. It's way too easy for us to only be observers. We can have expectations out of our children. We just should try to make certain that those expectations are built based upon what are we trying to do that's an improvement for their life as opposed to a reflection of our own.
Yeah, and sometimes giving disappointing news or having to say no to something or rejecting somebody is hard. It's hard to do, especially if we're conflict avoiders and people pleasers. Mm-hmm. And as parents, sometimes it might be easier to lie to the child and rather than really tell them why they can't do something or something that's not available for them. And I think the biggest thing is don't lie to your children. That's going to impact your relationship and their trust in you.
And let's use that to kind of close out this segment. Mm-hmm. As a child, 2 to 4, it's important that your child's learning how to relate to other children. But sometimes we get past that stage and there's a small percentage of those children who don't learn that and they become more aggressive. We've talked about in other shows about the importance, especially of boys being able to do rough and tumble play. That's a part of who boys are. But they get to that stage where regardless of what happened, things go wrong and you start to see that they're being sucked into some type of organization that you really don't want them to do. That last part, I think, is really important. We know from working with people who have become extremists that showing them facts don't work. Giving them an expert that says, hey, what you're saying right now, it's just not true. Not only does it not work, oftentimes some of them will become more violent. What does work? Getting them to focus on other priorities, because they do have other priorities in their life, who they love, they have the priority of their job, they have priorities sometimes of their kids. The last thing, though, that's important is that if you really want to help that person who's crossed that Rubicon, it comes from listening to them. It comes from engaging with them. Our kids are the same thing. If you decide to not listen to them and to scoff off how they're thinking, even though some of the things they may be thinking are a complete anathema to how you see things. They're just going to learn to talk to someone else. Mm-hmm. And that talking to someone else can be really, really dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, this can be hard, especially when you want to just, shake a person out of what they're believing, especially if it's somebody that you love and really care about. And I see this in therapy a lot is when people are more paranoid or anxiety driven or nervous or, have this fear of loss of control, that they're more crisis oriented and they may be more easily persuaded by information that is helping to calm their amygdala, which is operating on a hyperdrive because they're on this fear, fight, or freeze response. And so if their focus is being shifted on other things, that helps to calm their nervous system, and they're actually gaining more confidence and a sense of security, then it can become easier because now they're more in this rational state. They can actually weigh evidence for and against different things, but helping them come to that conclusion on their own rather than it being forced upon them. And sometimes it's a matter of not even targeting the line of questioning or information that you're giving them, particularly around any kind of ideologies or paranoid ideation, and really just helping to solidify things that are around them, that they're engaging socially with other people, their basic needs are getting met, that they're working, that they're functioning at a higher level. Once you be able to achieve that higher baseline of functioning, that's when it can be a safer time to then approach the ideologies through lines of questioning that really helps them to uncover it for themselves.
Right. Helping them understand is much more important than telling them what they're going to have to do. Again, especially as they start becoming teenagers and they do have a mind of their own. And maybe they've begun to form some cognitions and some emotions that are working against them. So, all right, Dr. Bashah, thank you. We appreciate you coming on. Hopefully this will help a number of those people who've called in and asked, what do they do? Yeah, and we'll attach a worksheet to this that we're currently working on that seems quite connected
obviously
to the topics.
For
many of them, they also may just need to get professional help.
Yes, absolutely.
So, all right. Thank you again, Dr. Bashah. This is Paul Johnson. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for taking part in our show. Feel free to leave us comments, questions, queries, things that you're concerned about. We'd love to hear it. Take part in, if you can, by subscribing to our show or buying into our premium program. Thanks again. Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Thanks for joining The Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.